Welcome you to this. Thank you. Welcome you to this panel discussion. We're honored to have the James W. Foley Foundation here, and Diane, who's become a friend and a colleague in this important area. So we're so happy to have you, and we're going to have an important panel discussion here on crimes against Americans abroad. Diane and her team have worked very hard to assemble a wonderful group, and we thank you for your time and attention here today. And we're so pleased to be able to co-sponsor this between the National Press Club Journalism Institute and the James W. Foley Foundation. So Nancy is going to introduce the panelists.
Yes, I am.
And we're so glad to have you here as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. It's such a wonderful opportunity to talk about an important subject. I have one housekeeping measure to announce, and then I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel. The BBC is here filming, and I wanted to let anyone know if you have any concerns about potentially appearing on screen. There's a very nice man back there who you can speak to. He's raising his hand right now. But I wanted to make sure everybody knew. And if everyone's good to go, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic today. You know, for two reasons. I think so often people think of kidnapping and hostage situations as an issue that maybe doesn't touch them because maybe I wouldn't know anyone from Syria, one might think, or I wouldn't know somebody held in Iraq. But I think this issue really speaks to sort of a basic expectation that one has from their government, which is to look out for them and their interests when they're in a dangerous situation. And that really transcends this experience. And I think having this discussion is a wonderful way to get at why that is such an important topic for us as citizens to talk about in terms of what we expect from our government, what accountability looks like. And I think this panel in particular is such a wonderful group to talk about this issue, because what you'll see amongst the five esteemed people I'm joined with is people who are looking at this specific issue from literally every vantage point with which we as a society tackle it. We have Jason Rezaian, who's here, who is a Washington Post correspondent, who was held for 544 days in Iran and has spoken so eloquently and has written beautifully in a book about his experiences. So he obviously was the center of the focus of a situation that he was in. I'm joined by Diane Foley, who's the mother of James Foley, who was held by the Islamic State and killed by the Islamic State, and throughout his detention handled the situation with such grace and compassion as she learned to navigate the government systems that she had to work through to try to do the best that she could for her son, and has subsequently really dedicated herself with such grace in terms of helping families, helping Americans, and helping bring this topic to the fore, and is the reason we're here today, so thank you. And we're here with Brett McGurk as well, who's the special envoy on the former special envoy for global campaign against ISIS. And I love that Brett is here because he's been someone who's had to deal with this, sometimes leading the talks on behalf of the United States. He was in Geneva to meet Jason when he was released, and I think he brings such an interesting on-the-ground vantage point in terms of what government is trying to do when they're confronted with these situations, often with not the resources that one might think that they would have when confronted with them. And to his right is Karim Khan, who is the special advisor and head of the UN Investigative Team to promote accountability for ISIS crimes. And I think Karim brings such an interesting international perspective of how do you hold groups accountable, what does accountability look like, and how do we reach consensus in the international community about how to approach crimes associated with kidnapping and hostage-taking and holding those accountable. And finally, we're joined by Terrence Rea, who has such a wonderful project. He's the founder of the Center of Peacekeeping at Marquette University. And I love that Terrence is here because I think what he gets at the ultimate sort of macro approach to this, which is coming up with ways to prevent these situations from arising in the first place. What can we do to have that discussion, to be proactive, to sort of promote an environment such that this is not an issue that we're having to deal with as frequently as we are. And so I'd like to, before I invite everybody to sort of give their perspectives, I hope you'll join me in congratulating Terry and Brett and Jason as they are recipients of the James Foley Foundation Awards today. So Jason, I'm going to start with you, and what I'd love for each panelist to do is from their own perspective talk about what accountability looks like. And you'll notice that we're going to go from sort of from the ground as broad up as we can. And so Jason's going to kick us off. And I'd love to just hear your thoughts, how you think of accountability given your experiences.
Well, I think when we look at hostage cases, first and foremost, we have to separate them out, right? I mean, there are cases of terrorists, pirates taking hostages, and then there's also the cases like mine of kind of state-held hostages. I was taken prisoner by the Iranian government in 2014. I'd been living in that country for 5 years, working as a correspondent with permission to do that work. It was a job that I did very transparently and above board, and I was a known commodity in the world of international journalism. And I was taken what appears to be for reasons of political leverage. And fortunately, the United States government was able to get involved and through the work of Brett and others, negotiate a release. And I think that that's the best case scenario. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen every time. And I think that in the world that we're living in right now, these instances of state-sponsored hostage-taking are increasing by the day. It's become a practice that more and more governments are taking part in, and one that I'm deeply concerned about, and I think we should all be more concerned about. I'm having concerns about getting on a plane to travel to any foreign country at this point because I feel as though I or any one of us as Americans are seen as valuable to other governments for their own political needs. So I think that the accountability is multifold, right? First and foremost, we have to figure out how to root out this problem, make it more difficult for people to take hostages. And secondly, what is the government of the U.S.'s accountability towards our citizens? What I've seen recently is that it depends on who we're dealing with, right? Who is the country on the other side or a group on the other side that is responsible for a crime against an American. And I don't think that we've come up with a set of answers on how we deal with these situations. It's not uniform. And I'm glad that we're here to be able to kind of start talking about that, because I don't think this problem's going away. I think it's just going to get worse.
Thank you. It's such great points. I'm looking forward to asking you about them.
Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Diane Foley, and I'm really here because our oldest son, Jim, was a freelance conflict journalist who'd been working in Iraq and Libya and the last time in Syria, covering the conflicts in those areas. And he was taken hostage in November of 2012. And held until he was killed in 2014. And unlike Jason, we did not know initially who had taken him. We had no idea. And we didn't even know if he was alive for many, many years. And so it's just another type of horrendous kidnapping that is taking place around the world. Sometimes by governments who want leverage, sometimes by criminal gangs or terrorists who want to terrorize us and feel this is a good way to do just that. Very complex issues, truly. So after Jim died, I just felt compelled as an American that we must do better. We must find ways to have the backs of our brave Americans, particularly when they're out in the world working as journalists or aid workers or educators or traveling because they want to understand and know the world. And I feel like theoretically our government does do that, but in practical ways, it's not easy. And it's often very difficult, as I found out. So after Jim was killed, we started the James Foley Legacy Foundation to advocate for Americans who are taken hostage or unjustly detained, to raise these issues and to help us as Americans to decide, how do we feel about these things in the world? Is it a priority to bring Americans home, or is it not? Are we on our own? And if we're on our own, you know, people traveling need to be aware of that, because millions of us travel every day, right? So I just feel these are very important issues. And the other part of our foundation work is around the protection of the increasing numbers of journalists who are truly freelance. They're out there without media companies backing them, out there bringing us back photos, information about what's happening all over the world. So I really appreciate your attention today. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Nancy.
Brett, I was wondering if you could speak about it, given you've had such a unique seat in terms of how do you think about accountability as someone who's had to work that initial stage of trying to reach a negotiation?
First, I'm just so honored to be here, particularly on the stage with Diane. And thank you so much for having me. And accountability is a big question. I think when you're working these issues inside the U.S. government, just the breadth of issues that we all work on. I'm looking at Jen Easterly in the front row, who handled our counterterrorism file in the White House under President Obama. It's just so vast. And the difference with these issues is it's so personal. I mean, you get to know the families, you get to know the stories. These are our fellow citizens, and we do have an obligation to our fellow citizens. They're also extremely difficult. As Jason said, there's a big difference between a state versus a non-state actor versus something like ISIS or Al-Qaeda versus the Taliban. There's a whole kind of range of how you have to address these things. But the issue of accountability is a big one, and the gentleman sitting to my right, Karim Khan, really has the file, the mandate from the UN Security Council as part of that process to ensure we had the mandate from the Security Council so that we have international accountability and justice for the crimes of ISIS, which really committing acts of genocide, terrible things against their own citizens, against Iraqis and Syrians, and to make sure there's a historical record for what these terrorists actually did. And I think Karim's job is really critical, and I think really could use an even broader focus to internationalize it, even just beyond the borders of Iraq. So it's a very difficult issue. Accountability comes into holding people accountable, so we have a historical record. It comes into, I was in Tampa just last week for the change of command with our Special Forces Command, and one of their core missions from our Special Forces is hostage rescue. And so that's another thing, of course, that comes into our daily work in terms of how do we actually try to rescue our fellow Americans and our brave special forces who try to do that work every day. So it's difficult. It's interwoven with so many legal and ethical and moral questions. I think that's why this panel is so important. So thank you.
Thank you. Karim, do the video work? We're going to try to get I'm going to introduce Karim with a video, and then I'm going to open it up for his comments.
Yes. Well, while we have a 1-minute video, but can I also start by really
That would be wonderful.
applauding Diane and also the Press Club and the Foley Foundation for the invitation. Diane, really you are a lady of unique poise and courage, and it really is very humbling to share a table with you, and I think the role you're playing is critical. The United States is not alone. I think this is very important to understand. It's not under siege from the rest of right-minded, right-thinking people of the world. American culture, American music, arts, principles of democracy have for many years gone beyond the borders of this great nation. There are, when assessing this issue, a hard core of individuals that are criminals. And in relation to that hardcore group that wish to undermine democratic values, of course, there requires unity, a unity of approach. But I think it's very important also to keep a degree of objectivity, that the United States is not under siege. It has many, many friends in the world, not only across the Atlantic, United Kingdom that I come from, the so-called special relationship with Europe, but also many countries, east and west and north and south. My mandate was passed in September of 2017 by the Security Council because of the repeated acknowledgement that Daesh, the un-Islamic state, ISIS, represents a threat to international peace and security. And the mandate has three main limbs. The first is to gather evidence, to collect evidence, and to investigate in Iraq, and to feed into domestic legal systems so that there is a fair trial. So not just in Iraq, it could be United States, it could be in Germany, wherever there are trials in domestic courts, we can feed in and put forward dossiers so there can be fair trial. The second freestanding but linked leg of Security Council Resolution 2379 is that I'm required to promote throughout the world accountability for Daesh crimes. The third is the possibility of any member state of the United Nations to make a request to me to investigate Daesh crimes on their territory. And in that third scenario, my initial job is a postman. I am to receive that information and pass it to the Security Council, who will make a political decision as to whether or not to authorize me to conduct investigations on that territory. So they are the prime issues of UNITAD. In this case, in the very tragic case that we've seen, I think it's important to understand that the direct perpetrators are really the lowest level very often. They may be removed by kinetic measures, they may be already have been tried and removed, either imprisoned or in some legal systems executed. But the realization that accountability serves myriad purposes. The phenomena of Daesh did not emerge in a sporadic, haphazard way by chance. So those that very successfully recruited, those that financed and organized, the brains of the outfit are the key group to focus on if we're to really try to prevent the metastasization of Daesh from country to country, from Afghanistan to Central Asia to Southeast Asia, of course Iraq and Syria, Libya, Sahel, and of course then into Europe and other parts of the world. And I think in that accountability is key. I think we have a video for 1 minute, which unfortunately you'll hear more of my voice. I apologize for that, but if it could be played, please. In investigating ISIL or Daesh, we're confronted with a criminality on a scale we have seldom seen. It is very clear that in the confines of a courtroom, their contorted and twisted ideology can be fully debunked as having no connection with the peaceful religion that is Islam. As we know, the Quran says that to kill one person is as if to kill all of humanity. Gender, race, sexuality, whether Sunni or Shia, Christian or Yazidi, Kakai or Shabak or Sabia, or any other community, there is no hierarchy of victims. Those differences are irrelevant when we are investigating what may amount to crimes against humanity, war crimes and genocide. If we are all united, my team and the Iraqi government, all of us, the international community, together with the Iraqi people, God willing, inshallah, we can achieve some measure of accountability in order to chart a bright future for all citizens of the Republic of Iraq. So this short piece was to focus, on Iraq. But as I said, whatever the political divisions, whatever the fractured state of international relations are when one surveys the world, we need to find ultimately common ground. The most encouraging aspect that we have in UNITAD is unanimity. The Security Council, for all the divisions that we see, are unanimous in recognizing that accountability is an essential requirement to stabilization and to also separate the poison of Daesh from the Sunni community, which is important in Iraq and the region and for many reasons, to provide a record that prevents revisionism. And also, as I said there, in the disciplined environment of the courtroom, to do what Nuremberg did so well, which is to create a record that stands the test of time. This is not about human rights and a gold star for having lawyers in robes and judges bowing and saying, "May it please the court." It's the realization that accountability, according to international standards, has a quality, an impact all of its own, and it can also play into creating a firewall in terms of educating communities that may be susceptible to the Daesh philosophy, in preventing, hopefully, what I described as the spread of this virus of Daesh elsewhere. So I think that's an overview, and I'm grateful for the chance to say a few words about it.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the video, because I think what it illuminates is the efforts you're doing mirror really a lot of efforts that Americans here are doing as well, meeting with local officials, raising awareness of this, and trying to create a system of accountability. So it's wonderful to see similar work happening around the world. And finally, Terry, I was wondering if you've worked so hard to sort of really get at this in a proactive way, and I'm curious how you think of accountability and how much you think of it as sort of helping long-term in terms of preventing future kidnappings and hostage situations.
Well, I appreciate the superb mission that I just heard enunciated. A comment on the word accountability, because I take a restorative justice approach to this. Not necessarily retributive, that could be part of it. But accountability, I think, is equated almost in people's minds with punishment. Now, incarceration is a passive action. Incarceration, anytime a defense lawyer meets the defendant for the first time, they say, deny it, deny it. 93% of the cases in the US never go to trial. People never get to confront the perpetrator of the crime. And in jail, the whole idea is to deny, stay safe. Accountability, on the other hand, is a positive. It means four things. It means, one, the perpetrator admits their crime. Second, they admit the greater harm that they have done to other people because of their actions. Third, they show remorse. And fourth, they try to do something to overcome the harm that's been done. Now, restorative justice, as most of you know, takes the point of the view of the victim first. And in this case, families or survivors, as Jason, and try to have their needs met first. And the needs which can eventually be very well met through the process that the UN is trying to pursue, it means they get a chance to be heard about their pain. They know that people recognize the harm that's been done to them. Well, I mean, if you're talking about people like the Beatles, the name given to the captors of James Foley, it would be hard to imagine that being confronted with their crimes, no matter how vociferously, no matter how much pain was demonstrated, no matter how much rejection they met, and it's hard to imagine that that would break through. I would guess most of us would assume that. So thinking about that, why don't we take a different angle? I mean, one at a time, eventually with careful evidence. That is great. But why would we not have a major trial in absentia sponsored by a legitimate organization where a lot of the anger from families, a lot of the facts can be brought out? A restorative justice situation is not just the immediate victim. It would be related people who have been harmed by this terrible, terrible crimes of Daesh. Why not have part of that imams who see the world differently? Why not have it be so well publicized that Daesh is clearly indicted in the eyes of the world? the way most of us have reacted to those terrible crimes individually. Why not have it be a major mounted campaign to go along with the individual attempts to bring justice, which is not the same as accountability. Accountability is when people change and admit their crimes. So it's a suggestion.
It's a very interesting one, and I'm so glad you shared it. And it gives us a lot, everyone has given us a lot to talk about. What I'd like to do is ask the panelists some questions, and I'd like to open the discussion to all of you, and hear your questions. And I hope that this isn't a discussion between us, because I think it's beneficial for all involved. So I'm going to start with you, Diane, if I could. You know, maybe because I'm a news person, when I think of the news right now and the fact that people are declaring the end of ISIS, at least as a physical caliphate, and that there's been an attempt to kind of put an end date, a finality to the Islamic State, at least for now, as a physical state. But I know one of the things that you're doing is really trying to create a system where those who are involved in crimes related to kidnapping and hostage taking are brought to justice in a U.S. court system. That is, that while that caliphate is dead, that there is some sense of accountability for those who perpetuated the state, who carried out crimes in that self-proclaimed state. And I'm curious what kind of, first of all, how did you get started on this? What drove you to do it? And I'm curious what kind of reception you've got. What surprised you in terms of the response? And what do you think are the biggest obstacles going forward to actually having a fighter who lived in some place like Raqqa coming back to the United States and being put forth in a U.S. court system?
Well, thank you, Nancy. I guess that's a big question. What the main reason I feel it's essential is because unless we hold people accountable for crimes, unless there's some deterrence, hey, we'll just keep doing what we feel like. There's no problem, no repercussion for taking people, for holding them, for torturing them. And particularly as our government, I can only speak, for my little experience, but here in the U.S., again, it's a way of having the backs of our Americans. If they do not come home, like, thanks be to God, Jason did come home. But if they don't come home, like our son and like several other Americans who were with him, Peter Kasich, Steven Sotloff, Kayla Mueller, Luke Summers, it goes on, then they can continue to take our citizens. There's no deterrence, there's no consequence for them, and thus they can continue their reign of terror around the world. And so I am so grateful for the work within our government, that Brett and Jen and Karim, but also for the other view of how do we get some restorative justice. Unless the world holds these folks accountable in this ISIS group, really tries to stop them, we have not found the leader. Al-Baghdadi's still at large. Yes, the area has shrunk, but the leadership is who knows where. There's sleeper cells all over the world. They're just waiting for the opportunity to come alive again. So I just feel that we must do what we can to stop this. And one way is two of the Beatles, the British jihadists who captured James, were captured last year. It's been over 16 months now. They're being held in northern Syria, but no one is willing to take them on, if you will, and bring them to trial. It's complicated. It's not easy to convict these guys, very shrewd men who knew how to protect themselves, cover their faces, all this kind of thing. Not easy to do at all. But we need to have the will and the determination, I think, to, when people harm our citizens, that we need to hold people accountable for those crimes. I feel without it, the danger's multiplied.
It's interesting in your answer, and you talked about sort of the deterrence, the sense of that there's a repercussion. I'm curious, and forgive me if this is a personal question, do you think of it in terms of confronting them personally as a family member, having the opportunity to sort of express in a forum like a courtroom your feelings, your experience? I'm curious how much of that is part of a necessary part of the process.
I don't know. I mean, everybody's different, Nancy. I don't know if that's as necessary for me. I guess I feel they should be held, they should be tried, and if they're the true perpetrators who kidnapped and tortured Jim and helped in his execution, I feel they should spend the rest of their lives considering their crimes. And maybe at some point in time they can have some remorse. At some point in time they might be open to understanding that. At this point, I would doubt it. But so I just feel they shouldn't be free to continue their terror inflicted on others. I guess that's my biggest concern, is that all these hundreds of jihadi fighters are being held in such a tenuous situation in northern Syria. I'm just afraid that they'll escape and that that they will continue what they've done. So,
Thank you. Jason, I wanted to talk to you because it was interesting in reading your book and some of your writings how you talk about in the beginning you thought maybe this would last for a few days, and I think there was sort of a feeling that there would be some American intervention, and of course that did happen. What was interesting to me too, though, but then you've decided to sue the Iranian government, and of course you have that vehicle in a way that other families don't. And I'm curious, at what point did you decide to do it directly rather, because as I read your book, I imagined it was something you thought that would sort of be handled by the government rather than by you individually. I was wondering if you could walk me through how it became something you did and what drove your decision.
So, I had a couple of things going for me personally. One, I read a lot of history of U.S.-Iran relations. And obviously I'm not the first American taken hostage by the Iranian government. We got a 40-year history of that. And when the embassy hostages were released in 1981, part of the Algiers Accord was that the U.S. government had kind of signed away their right to hold Iran accountable internationally. And I knew that I would have that right someday. And actually my captors tried to get me to sign documents that, towards the end of my time in prison there, that I would not sue them in international courts. It was sort of what they claimed was part of the preconditions of my release. And then as the days got closer to my release, I realized this was well beyond anything that I had any bearing on, so I was not going to give them that satisfaction. It wouldn't have mattered anyway, right? If I signed some document that I was presented in an Iranian prison, I don't think that the U.S. government would give much credit to it. But the fact is, in July of 2014, my wife and I were at home. We were ambushed, blindfolded, taken at gunpoint to a prison, thrown into solitary confinement. Months of interrogation began immediately. At no point was I allowed to see a lawyer. Everything that was being said about me and to me was being broadcast in a very highly orchestrated, state-funded propaganda campaign against me. And it really destroyed my life in the country that my wife and I choose to live and work in. I was supposedly convicted of espionage and other crimes against Iran's national security. In that trial, I didn't have the opportunity to coordinate with counsel. I did have a lawyer, but I was never able to speak with her. She was never able. The one time that I was able to have a meeting with her, the judge and the prosecutor were in the room. There was no evidence in the case. There were no witnesses. And as of this moment, that's the only official accounting of my imprisonment in Iran. So that's why I sued. You know, it was a lever of justice that was available to me here in the country of my birth that wasn't available to me in the country of my residence. And I've written a book about my experience, but, you know, a book is a story. It's a narrative. I want, as you know, Karim and Brett were talking about, Diane reiterated, I want a document, a historical document of what happened, an official accounting. And it's a public filing, contrary to what the Iranians did. It's the Iranian case is a secret one, so there's no public records. Everything that I'm contending is available to anybody here who has an internet connection, and it's backed up with facts. And so that's why I did it. I did it, one, to have an official record of what happened to me for all of history, and two, hopefully, that there would be a deterrent factor in the future. Now, I know from speaking to folks in and out of the State Department that representatives of the Iranian government are very upset that I sued them. You know, they think that they should be allowed to get away with this. They think that they should be allowed to get away with this because for 40 years they've been allowed to get away with this. Since my release, other Americans and other nationals of allied countries have been taken and held hostage. One of them, a mother, a British Iranian mother, who tomorrow will spend her third anniversary of being away from her toddler and husband. And so, you know, when I talk to these families of people who still have relatives in prison in Iran, because it's a situation that I know about probably as well as anybody, they often come to me with questions and concerns, and my family as well. But when I made that filing, and when I went to testify in court, I got messages from several of the families saying, you know, our loved one who's in prison in Iran thanks you for doing that, because you're doing it for all of us. I didn't take that on as a responsibility. I did it for myself and for my family, but also, you know, in the hopes that other people won't have to do this, won't have to go through this in the future. And I don't know if it's the magic bullet that's going to stop them. Iran's got dozens of hostage-related judgments against them in American and international courts. And, you know, mine is just the most recent and high-profile one. But I wouldn't undo that for anything, because it was my opportunity for justice and accountability.
I wanted to turn over to Terry because I thought you had such an interesting perspective on accountability and justice, and sort of making a delineation between how we think about those topics. And I'm curious if you could spell out from your perspective, when you talk about a court in absentia, what are some of the formats that you think about? What are some of the processes that you would have in place such that it can be an effective means in the absence, in some cases, as in Jason's case, of sort of a formal system in that country, or in the case of Syria, the inability up until now at least to bring perpetrators of these crimes to justice?
And there's so many people beyond people from our country that have been affected by ISIS. So many people that have been dealt with terribly in that country that are looking for the same kind of outcome, that are looking, and I would see a trial in absentia including people within Syria and Iraq that have been horribly harmed by ISIS to be included, not just Americans or people that have been kidnapped. I mean, in a major way, would it require evidence? That's for sure. But I think so much evidence is there, sufficient to successfully try them in individual courts, not always. But for ISIS as a whole, the evidence of their crimes, I believe, is there. My real starting point, however, is wanting those people that have been affected by it to have a chance to at least have their pain recognized. I mean, Diane and John and their family have done such a magnificent, positive approach to changing the situation, but so many people don't have that opportunity. So looking at it from a restorative justice point of view starts with the victims and their families. What can we do now? I mean, it would be very gratifying for everybody harmed to hear what you are doing individually. But I don't know that people know that. I didn't know that you are taking such a careful, meticulous approach to bringing people to justice. Accountability is what we're looking for the victims, and if possible, for the criminals. There are so many cases in our country of restorative justice between murderers and their victims. And when the murderer hears the kinds of pain that those people have endured, they change. It's not just forgiveness, but there is always that possibility for other human beings. So I would not rule it out. I just don't think, it's that not as practical as giving people. I think of the trial of Eichmann, that got that kind of worldwide attention. In that case, they were bringing an individual to trial, so it's different. But it's not different in that this cries out for somebody. The UN is a likely sponsor for such a trial.
I'm curious, do you think of it as a form of deterrence in a way, in that people seeing?
I do. The videos of beheadings were used for recruitment and evidently were successful. Is there any other united voice against their crimes that we've heard? No. So do I think that would be a deterrence? I do. For them to be painted with that brush of totally uncivilized, non-religious people would be helpful.
Karim, you're in a very interesting position because you're in a country where a lot of ISIS fighters might be coming through, might be going back, might be doing cross-border activities, and I'm curious what the reception has been in Iraq. How do they think about prosecuting suspected ISIS fighters? How is it different than we think about it here? And what do they think of when they think of accountability? That is, how are they defining it? Do they define it differently than perhaps an American audience would?
I think there's an awful lot of common values, and the values of somebody who's lost a son in the United States may be more eloquently expressed, but at essence it's the same feeling, the same hurt, the same tear in the soul that a mother will feel that may be Iraqi or in Myanmar or in any other part of the world. We're bound together by this common bond of humanity, and I think it can be advanced or articulated differently, but underlying there's a commonality of suffering. Our mandate, and Rea, I must applaud Brett McGurk for his support. He was the ambassador and representative of the Global Coalition. Underlying it is a realization by the Council that you can't have a one-size-fits-all formula to international justice. The restorative system of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was so nobly led by Nelson Mandela in South Africa was at a different time with a different progression, and so it could work. Dealing with Daesh in Iraq, of course, we need to look at the particular issues and try to make a bespoke system of accountability that can be as effective as possible. Iraq has supported this resolution. Without that support, there wouldn't have been unity in the Council. What we have to try to do, and this is the role of the United Nations, is to work collaboratively to make sure that we can work not simply to get people removed on a conveyor belt system of justice that you see in various parts of the world, but in accordance with international human rights standards and best practice, so that a record is created that is qualitatively different from the polemics or political characterizations that come from different capitals. This is the lesson of Nuremberg. It wasn't simply Stalin or Churchill simply criticizing the Nazis. It was putting it in the harsh glare of the law. The principles of fascism disintegrated. Nobody could say or be ever taken seriously if they sought to say, well, the principles of Mein Kampf could purport to be some kind of pseudo-political philosophy. And I think that lesson of the law, what I call the disciplined environment of the law, is really important. Just if I can say one thing in relation to restorative justice, I think the great thing of international law and the great thing of the law is the latent potential. Very often lawyers are the worst people to apply it, because lawyers very often, particularly common law lawyers, were guided by precedent. So we tend to do the same thing again and again without unleashing really the potential of the law. But when we look at the restorative justice and international law, we can look at International Criminal Court and elsewhere, that victims do have a part to play in the courtroom. Even in our mandate, the views of survivors must have a very important role. But I think some civil law systems in the continental Europe and elsewhere, they do allow trials in absentia, only when the perpetrator cannot be identified. Here, as Diana said, we have in many parts of the world, people are in custody. People are also free. The best type of record is where you confront the individual, and not all individuals will either have the intelligence, the open mind, the compassion, the heart, or the decency, simply say, yes, it's terrible what I've done. So there, when you're dealing with the real virulent hatred that underlines a ideology, what one can do is freeze it and forensically dissect it and serve it for individuals that may be susceptible to that ideology, to see how hideous, how ugly that menu is that this group is seeking to serve for others to digest. And I think that is why I'm a firm believer not in Russell tribunals, which sometimes happen in relation to historic issues or even trials in absentia that we see, for example, in the Tribunal for Lebanon. But when the accused is possible, the lesson of Nuremberg needs to be taken on board. Otherwise, the promise of Nuremberg, which has been a false promise of never again, never again, never again, will continue to be what it has been, unfortunately, a hope, but a lie. And I think that's where the rule of law, together with other measures of education and development, need to be part of a wider tapestry.
It seems the most sort of immediate problem, and I'll open this up to everyone to answer, is if you have governments that don't want to take any sort of possession of citizens who are being detained in Syria, you have people who are removing passports, not even willing to engage with their citizens in an effort to sort of create a distance between that citizen and their crimes and ISIS and their country. How do you even have the opening steps for some sort of justice when there's almost an impulse to try to create a barrier between that detainee and the government that's already in place? I mean, it seems like Iraq is one of the few places where we'll have a practice of these kinds of court systems, because at least they have been willing to take in their citizens who are suspected members of ISIS.
Yeah, can I?
Yeah.
I think an issue that loops in what everybody was discussing, but particularly Diane. So in Syria right now, we have this extraordinary situation. We have in one camp, the United Nations just put out a report this morning, actually. In one camp, in December, there were about 10,000 people. Now there are 80,000 people. And 15% of them are foreign. So that's about 10,000 foreign from 57 countries around the world. So that is both a humanitarian problem, but it's also, we have this unique situation in terms of the evidence of what happened. So these 10,000 people that came from all around the world, how did you get here? Who recruited you? Who paid you? What did you see? That's evidence. And if we don't get this right, I think we're going to look back and say, wow, we really had an opportunity here. Not only to make sure that the terrorists amongst this population, and these are indoctrinated people who have not renounced ISIS, General Vattel very famously said, they're not they're coming out of the last stronghold. They're not surrendering. They're still totally indoctrinated. They believe eventually they'll get out of these prisons and they'll be free again. But we have them now in these camps. And yet the U.S. government, we're reducing our forces in northeast Syria. Well, I think we need to rethink this because the situation is so dynamic. And any way you look at it, protecting ourselves, making sure these people can never get out, making sure we have an evidentiary basis of what actually happened. And then what do you do with the people who committed terrible crimes against American citizens? I agree with Diane. I think let's actually put them into our Article 3 court system. I think there's a risk. I know if you talk to the Department of Justice, there's always a risk that evidence on a battlefield, how does it correlate into an American court? These are very difficult questions. But I think to do justice and also create the historical record, we have an opportunity now in northeast Syria with all of these people who are eyewitnesses to these crimes. And what do we do? It is an international problem, and nobody wants to take their citizens back. I worked on this a little bit. It's very difficult, but we're leaving it to the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurds, the Arabs, the fighters that we had trained to hold these people in camps, and they don't have much resources. So it's a huge problem, and it's going to have to be addressed by really the international community, not just us.
You know, one of the things I was struck by in my own exposure to some of these cases is you have different government agencies involved with sort of different vantage points approaching these issues, and we've just recently kind of gotten around a united sort of position in the form of a directive. But of course, a directive is sort of at the discretion of the administration. And I'm curious, having worked in both administrations, what are sort of major differences you've seen from the Obama administration to the Trump administration in terms of how they deal with hostage cases? We've heard a real commitment from the Trump administration to go after. And yet a lot of the issues that we're talking about are things that have been there long before there was a directive that dealt with these issues. I was just curious if there are connective threads that you see in terms of problems or areas where you're starting to see improvement.
One connective thread, which I think is encouraging, is under President Obama, we established a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs. And that was a unique position, and the Trump administration has carried that forward. And I actually met with Robert O'Brien yesterday, who's handling this for the Trump administration, and he's doing a terrific job, and they're really beefing up that staff in that office. So I think it's good that continuity has really carried forward on this critical issue. But that also what's a hostage case? What's a consular case? These are also very difficult questions. But I think the fact that institution, which was set up under President Obama, carried forward under President Trump, is being resourced under President Trump and under Secretary Pompeo, I think is a positive thing.
The other thing I wanted to open up to the group, Jason, you made reference to this earlier, and I think it's something that keeps coming up is, traditionally it was government dealing with government, and now we have governments dealing with maybe rogue actors or states that we're not recognizing or not acknowledging. And so I'm curious, is there any sort of answer to create an accountability measure with so many different steps? That is, it's different if you're trying to hold the Iranian government accountable versus the Syrian government versus the Taliban versus the Iraqi government versus all these terrorist groups. And I'm just curious, can the U.S. system, which is really designed to deal with traditional state actors and that sort of common system, is there a mechanism, is there a way to reconcile that so that it can adjust to some of these untraditional forces holding its citizens?
I mean, I'm not an expert on it, but I think we kind of have to, right? And, I think to Brett's point about some of these cases being terrorist or consular cases and making these distinctions, well, I agree. We have to make those distinctions, but we have to have playbooks for each one of these. And I don't think that our play set is very defined or varied yet. And I think as time goes on and we deal with more and more of these cases, we have to use the experiences of the past to figure out how we're going to deal with the next wave of these, whether it's a state, terrorists, gangs, pirates, whatever, But the problem isn't going away, so we'd be wise to cultivate better deterrence plans and action plans. And I think having the presidential envoy office is a really important step. I'm glad that they're doing this work, and I'm glad to hear that they're beefing up their staff.
I'm curious to both of you then, do you find that you're having to sort of help guide that conversation, say based on these experiences there should be these multiple playbooks and there should be some variety in how you approach it and an ability to be flexible to the changing circumstances? That is, do you find government is turning to you for guidance about the best way to approach given your experiences? Is it a conversation, or do you find that the system is struggling to kind of adjust and create a more flexible approach to these problems?
Well, I feel more the latter, certainly not looking to me, but it's a challenge. I think our government is very challenged. You know, we have a mighty military, we have so many wonderful people in our State Department and such, but it's a challenge. And I think what's frightening to me, particularly with some of these terrorist groups, is they're incredibly shrewd. They know, and these governments, they know how our soft spots, they know how to get to us. And, you know, often they'll use hostage taking. They'll use, you know, the public execution of an American citizen to show us that they know how to get to us. So I think, I really feel our government is challenged with this and needs to take it on very seriously, because Americans do travel all the time. We travel for work, we travel for fun, we travel to learn and such. And I fear this is a continuing threat. This is the way a lot of countries who hate us, if you will, or hate, you know, the privileges and freedoms we have, jealous of them or whatever, get to us. And, you know, so I do feel it's tremendously challenging, and it requires the minds of all kinds of people, great diplomats, the patients, people who think about it in a bigger sense. And this is why I'm so grateful for you're here, and we welcome questions, because it's a huge challenge, I feel, Nancy. It's a biggie.
You know, Brett, I realized that you were in Iraq from the very beginning of the conflict, and I had lived there at the time and seen cases where people were being kidnapped, and you were having to confront the issues then. And I'm curious, because you've sort of experienced it through the whole trajectory, how much more did it dominate your work? How much more complicated did it get in the time from the time that you started Iraq to the time that you left your post in terms of dealing with this issue? Did you find that you were dealing with more complicated non-state actors, that you were dealing with terrorist groups who were leveraging them in different ways? I'm curious the evolution of this experience from a government perspective from 2003 to the time that you left government. If at all.
I think, so ISIS, which I was in Iraq when ISIS took Mosul and just kind of spread, and we were working to respond to it, it really was a quasi-state entity. I mean, let's face it controlled 8 million people. It was really mind-boggling when you go back to 2014.
Yeah.
8 million people under the control of ISIS, the size of the UK, almost 80,000 square kilometers. The Iraqi security forces had totally almost disintegrated. We had nothing to work with in Syria. This was an almost unsolvable problem. I had people come into my office early on and say, you know, ISIS is going to be here for its state now, and you should really engage with it as a state. And I said, well, we're not going to do that. But we had to think about how to respond, and I have to say, Diane in particular, it was really Jim's heroism and poise and dignity and this terrible tragedy that galvanized the entire world. I mean, I lived through this. I mean, we were figuring out how to respond to this, and we knew we had to bring the world together, and we were able, really starting at that point, to build the largest coalition ever, almost 80 international partners, to deal with this problem. And the success we've seen now, I think, is a testament to that. But we had to treat ISIS as a quasi-state entity, and there was a military component to it that was critical. There's a humanitarian stabilization component. And then, of course, the issue with Jason and the Iran negotiations, I was asked to do that in the middle of the ISIS thing. It was a very different file. But we were engaged in talks with Iran, so it made sense, obviously, to open a sensitive channel to try to deal with the people in the Iranian system who are holding Jason and other Americans. I don't know if that really answered your question, but I mean, ISIS was just a phenomenon that was so different. One thing we did do, I have to say, in building this coalition, because you would get all the countries around the table, starting with 12 countries, and everybody would, this is a coalition against ISIS, this is great in the United States of America, but it's also a coalition against, pick the enemy of that particular country. And we said, no, it's ISIS. This is a different, unique problem. We need to focus on it, be very mission focused. It's ISIS. And I think we succeeded because of that.
No, it just strikes me that in the course of your career, you've seen really a dramatic change, it seems like, when dealing with these cases. I remember in 2003, there was a threat. The journalists weren't seen as a threat in the way that they are now, or this sort of part of an information warfare. And it wasn't until 2004 and 2005 we started hearing about kidnappings. And even then, there was sort of an optimism that people would be released. And then it just kept evolving, not only the threat, but the targeting of journalists specifically. And to me, I think it speaks to Diane's point about how fluid this situation becomes, that any sort of preparation for this demands an ability to be flexible, because the nature of the threat and the way Americans are perceived, whether they be journalists or not, seems to be evolving so quickly. One of the challenges I think journalists find is what you think is safe today might not be safe tomorrow. And it strikes me that even for government, it's that adjustment as well. It strikes that you were dealing with, that what was in Mosul in May of 2014 was very different than what was there in June, and demanded a complete rethink about everything, including how to keep Americans safe.
I think one lesson: if you open up a vacuum, and a governmental system falls, most of the people are decent and good and moderate, but the people who take charge in that situation are going to be pretty bad. And I think that's a key. I was not in government in 2003 in the Iraq invasion of things, but if you go back to some of the assumptions going into Iraq, the assumption was that society would kind of carry forward, and I think that assumption was wrong. We've seen the same thing in Libya. Yeah, we've seen the same thing obviously in Libya and Syria, everywhere else. So in those environments, if you're going into them as a journalist or others, I think we've obviously learned the people who are going to be in charge in when those vacuums open up are going to be pretty hostile actors.
I'd like to open up to questions. I see a microphone, and we'll start right in the front row, if we could, please.
John Foley. In terms of, again, John Foley, in terms of a playbook, I was struck with the concept of negotiation, or our inability to negotiate with certain groups, terrorists, and making no concessions, all of that sort of thing. I understand some of the logic behind all of that, but how are we, as citizens, a country, et cetera, how are we going to deal with bringing Americans home when we limit our ability to communicate with the captors? I think there's a tremendous courage needed, humility, et cetera. But if we can't communicate at a very deep level, I'm not saying concede, but communicate at a very deep level, how are we ever going to, or do succeed in this effort? And if that is in fact happening, then I would take my question back. But I think that there isn't enough communication between the good guys and the bad guys, and I don't think that we're ever going to solve anything without it.
It's so difficult to answer just because of the continuum of these different terrible groups. We have 2 Americans being held by the Taliban. I'm obviously not privy to those discussions. I would assume Ambassador Khalilzad and his discussions with the Taliban were obviously advocating and working very hard for their release. We have an American held by a terrorist group in Mali, which I know we do not have any communication with. There's a different way to go about that. ISIS was just such a difficult and different phenomenon. We had no way to even penetrate into Syria in those days. It was a terrible situation. But I think on the spectrum from the Al-Qaedas to the Talibans to some of the other groups, I think that's where, at least when you're in government service, in terms of how can we actually use our leverage, is there a communication channel that I think people think about. But it's very difficult.
Yeah, and it is difficult because I think a lot of times in the past we felt we shouldn't negotiate, if you will. We shouldn't give them the respect to talk, interact. However, my experience has been if we don't do that, the chance of a hostage being released is very low. So it's, I think sometimes I think that's where we need some of our flexibility, that we need to be shrewd enough to know that we at times need to interact with some of these groups that truly hate us, but be shrewd enough to be getting information, know who we're talking to, or just can learn from who we're talking to about what they want. That gives us some hope of maybe being able to find some path for freedom for people they might be holding. But that's just my opinion. I mean, it's complicated, and I know, Brett, this is just, but I find that if we're talking about hostages, that it's very hard to, because a lot of times that's what they want. They want to interact with our government, and I can certainly understand that our government doesn't want to, interact with them. But then we have different outcomes sometimes.
If I could just add to that, one of the things I saw with Kayla Mueller's family, they did this documentary on ABC, and to see a family who didn't know anything about these issues being forced to sort of exchange Gmail accounts with their hostage negotiators because the U.S. wouldn't engage, you could just see the anguish of what the position and the policy does to a one family as they were struggling to negotiate with people on their own because the government wasn't able or willing to negotiate with them.
Well, that's what happened to us, Nancy.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the other side. So if our government chooses not to engage with captors, which I can understand, I mean, there's a lot of, this is not simple. For me, then the family has to. So that's what we were forced to do. Just like, we certainly didn't have any idea what we were doing. Yes. Jen.
Can I do a two-finger on that?
Yes.
We just need a microphone.
Please.
Thanks very much. Jen Easterly, I'm on the Foley Foundation board, and I was part of the team that worked very closely with Diane and many of the families to recreate a hostage policy. And I wanted to just jump on John and Diane's comments. One of the things that we took out of our 9-month work with the interagency and all of our discussions with Diane and John and the families was the importance of continuing to try and communicate and to negotiate with captors, whether that's criminal groups or terrorists or nation-state actors. In fact, if you look at Presidential Policy Document 30, we actually specifically wrote that in there, that no concessions does not mean no communications, because we recognize the importance of keeping that channel open. Now, certainly to Brett's point, I think some of the mechanisms that were put in place, like the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, some of the things that we built, some of them have been sustained into this administration. We've certainly seen the return through negotiations with state actors of many Americans abroad around the world, but certainly take away, and Diane, I don't know if you're going to talk about the report that you're going to issue here, certainly take away the continued need to make sure that there are those channels that need to stay open, because again, that was one of the big lessons learned that came out of the hostage policy review. Thanks.
I just want to say, recommend Joel Simon's book, We Want to Negotiate, and he reviews so many of these issues. The continuum from France that gets 98% of their citizens back because they don't have the policy of we won't negotiate with terrorists, and will pay, to our situation in England when it's maybe 25% we get back. Because his conclusions in the book about what has happened including the naming of the special advisor. I mean, he attributes so much of it to the Foley family and their pressure. But the conclusion that we don't negotiate with terrorists is a terrible opening gambit. I mean, it takes flexibility, it takes listening. That universal, even though so much of it makes sense because payments do go then to a broader terrorist effort. So where one stands on that continuum between France and the way the U.S. has handled things, you can only rejoice that there is increasingly what he calls strategic obscurity to begin the negotiations. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Diane Nissenbaum with the Wall Street Journal. Thank you all for the work you've done and the sacrifices that you've made. I wanted to ask you a little bit, especially Jason, Diane, and Brett. At the beginning, you mentioned that this is a president who's made releasing hostages a priority, and he's had some success in this. But it's a double-edged sword, as you suggested, that it shows other governments that if they do take an American, that is political cachet, it's an easy give for these other countries. So how do you wrestle with that? You obviously want a president who makes releasing Americans a priority, but at the same time, if he makes it a priority, then it shows, it sort of elevates their importance of people like that. How do you wrestle with that conundrum?
I mean, I've been since January of 2018 back at work at the Post, and this is an issue I write about probably more than anything else, and I don't have a real good answer about how I feel. I rejoice with all Americans anytime a hostage comes home, but I also wonder what went into bringing them home. And I think the successes of this administration so far on this have been admirable, but at the same time, there's a narrative that we just told them that they had to send them home, and then they came home. And the last guy and the guy before him weren't able to do that. And we all know that that's not what's happening. So I want to double down on what Terry just said. Read Joel Simon's book. Joel's in the room today. I just saw him a moment ago.
There he is.
And I think, for me, in reading the book, which came out the same day as mine, and
So read both books.
read them both. I was just struck by this idea that we have to have flexibility that Diane talked about in dealing with these issues, and also something that she said earlier. I mean, these terrorist groups and adversarial governments seem to really understand what makes us tick, what gets to us. I can't accept that the United States government doesn't have the resources to figure out what all of these other groups, what make them tick. And so I think we have to look at each one of these cases individually and figure out what it's going to take to bring somebody home. But as somebody who had the force of my employers, my family, the U.S. government, and public opinion working on my side to bring me home, I err on the side of we need to do whatever it takes to bring everybody home. Amen.
Good morning. Frank Lockwood with the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. Can you discuss Americans that are being held by the Assad regime and what's being done or what should be done to help them?
Well, I know of two public cases, and I probably know the least of this board here, but we have been working with the Austin Tice family, and more recently with Maj Kamalmaz, humanitarian psychologist who was just taken. He's a dual citizen, Syrian and American, went in to visit family and was just taken, kidnapped. So it's very complicated. It's very complicated. We obviously don't have diplomatic relations in Syria. Often Syria will not admit that they have these hostages, which makes it even more complicated. So it really, is very, very difficult, very poignant. We're talking years here. I mean, Austin was taken before Jim was, so in 2012. So here we are, 2019. So I would defer to others regarding that. Very, very complicated situations, and this is not unusual for this. The hostage taking requires a very multifaceted, shrewd approach, and I think as Americans we do have the resources to be as shrewd to figure it out, but we need to deploy them because a lot of these captors are incredibly shrewd. Do any of you have a better answer for this
Karim, I'm
gentleman?
curious how that comes up in your work in Iraq in terms of hostages in other countries and neighboring countries and that
Syria
cross-border. Yeah,
Well, I think it needs, from a legal perspective, I'm sorry to be boring,
and from Syria specifically.
but
yeah.
I think one can't conflate, the legal definition of a hostage. It may mean many different things, to be quite frank about it. We have in international law the Vienna Convention on consular assistance, so that if an individual is detained under the domestic laws of a state, of course, there's a right to consular assistance. Now, that may be leveraged, if there's not a fair trial, independent judiciary for other purposes. My focus, and working, within the remit of my jurisdiction, is when an individual is targeted as part of either a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population, or with an intent that may make it come to the qualitatively constitute the crime of genocide or be a war crime. The Geneva Conventions regulate the conduct of hostilities, and civilians are protected, and attacks against civilians constitute grave breaches. Now, within that spectrum of international law, that's the architecture, the lex lata, as we call it, the law as it is, in which we operate. Individuals may have the status colloquially as a hostage, but they may be targeted, in the case of journalists, for example, civilians, high-value targets, as part of a campaign of terror. Also to remove the, spotlight of scrutiny from war zones, so that only one voice emerges, the voice of those that are promoting, in the case of Daesh, a very virulent ideology. And it works, because we saw even after the, I'm sorry to say it, it works in part because after the executions and killings, various very respected press agencies refused to take stories from correspondents in those locations. And I can understand why. But at the same time, what the result of it was that a counter-narrative was removed from a particular theatre that, was dominated by a group conducting a crime of terror. So from my perspective, the focus is not simply against hostages. It's against targeting civilians, not just Americans, but civilians, as part of an international crime. And I think that's our focus. Within that, of course, we see individuals that are of all nationalities, including the United States, United Kingdom, France, and third country nationals have been. There is a reliable body of evidence, I think, to show that they have been targeted, and it may well constitute international crimes. So it goes back to the role of accountability, not as a silver bullet to solve all these problems, but as a vital component in terms of accountability, a narrative, and not just deterrence, but also trying to achieve some semblance of justice scrutiny.
Right, I was wondering if there are any insights you could give about how the U.S. goes about dealing with hostage cases in which they're believed to be in Western Syria under the Assad regime or elements associated with the Assad regime.
I don't think I have too much to add. I mean, the Assad regime is a state, so it's a UN-recognized government, even if it's one that we consider to be led by a war criminal. So there are ways to deal with a state that are very different than some of the other groups, and I think the government's doing all we possibly can to try to figure out some avenues, particularly for these two Americans under what we believe is under Assad's custody.
But can I just say, in that reality, where there are now, as a new reality, as a new phenomena, a prevalence of non-state actors. Of course, states may have, as part of their sovereignty, they may have different approaches. France was mentioned, the United States, United Kingdoms. That's a matter of sovereignty. But where international law comes in, and I think as fundamental principles, is that there's no statute of limitations for war crimes. There is an absolute jus cogens prohibition. It means an absolute promptory norm from which no derogation is permitted, preventing torture. There's no excuse, no leverage, no political negotiations, no economic arguments, no ideology can provide a cover for the prohibition against that fundamental foundation of international humanitarian law. And those individuals who perpetrate those acts that may constitute atrocity crimes should be under no illusion that there is no statute of limitation. The laws, and this is the lesson again from Nuremberg, we see 8-year-old Nazis that are still prosecuted. We see in Cambodia the ECCC, the Cambodia courts that are prosecuting today individuals from the Khmer Rouge period. I think that part is part of the architecture that is needed, and which can be preserved, notwithstanding any political deals that may be committed. But it can't, any political deal or any negotiation has a red line that it cannot cross in international law, which is the prohibition against international crimes.
Hi, Tom Durkin. I'm with both the Foley Foundation and the Center for Peacemaking. My question's probably towards Jason. Considering the dangers and the risks journalists face these days, and so the lack of journalists in places like Syria, how are we getting information? Are we getting information about what's going on? Like, I'm trying to think about this as like the public. Like, are we getting the story, or are we?
I mean, we're getting parts of it, right? And I mean, I think if we go back to my experience in Iran, one of the worst things that came out of that was a closing of the media space, right? It's not a coincidence that since the day that I was arrested in 2014, the number of Tehran byline stories in international news media has plummeted, right? And there's several reasons for that. One, as we talked about, news organizations are more reluctant to send somebody there. I mean, my news organization in particular, it's been 5 years since we've had somebody on the ground in Iran. And, I can't tell you how many resumes I get, saying, would you forward this on to Marty Barron and Doug Gell and see if they'd consider making me the new Tehran correspondent, your replacement? And because I'm not going back. But the reality is that the Post, as of now, has decided that they haven't tried to send somebody back. And not only are we not sending people back, other organizations as well. And people who are on the ground working for AP, New York Times, AFP, Financial Times, are reporting less and less and less. So that's one instance of what's happened to somebody, a journalist on the ground, closing up that space. In Syria, I wonder who is getting information out, how we verify those reports, and again in the Iran situation, I imagine in Syria as well, the people that are spreading images or stories are more often coming from an ideological bent than they would be if there were a greater presence of international media organizations on the ground in these places.
And if I may, I think that's so true. Fewer and fewer media companies want their good journalists to go to these dangerous parts of the world. I don't think there's any question. So they're creating these black holes where often we have to rely on civilian journalists people in country, brave people who are willing to find ways to get the truth out to various outlets. And the other way is freelancers, freelance journalists who feel empowered, feel compelled, if you will, to go into some of these countries to bring information out. And both of those are very risky for the individuals giving the information. So, like Jason said, a lot of the news coverage of what's really happening in these countries does, in fact, plummet. We just really don't know. And often in the others who want to kind of have this agenda pushed out into the world, that those can be more active. And so we don't have that balance that to counteract some of the jihadist ideology that is so terrorizing to our world. It's really complicated. Very good question, Tom.
We have time for one more.
Oh, I have the microphone.
Well, then I guess we know who's asking.
Does somebody else want a question? So,
I think it would be perfect that you ask the last question.
Bill McCarran at the Press Club. So November of last year, we were surprised that the Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs came to this room to speak and to take questions from reporters. And a lot of the reporters maybe didn't know we had a Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs. So what's the public communications part of that look like going forward? Is that part of the brief? Can it help fill, in a way, some of the information vacuum we have? And I think that event showed reporters are very willing to cover what the Special Envoy wants to say. We're interested in what's going to happen in the future. I just wonder what your thoughts are about that.
And I kind of leave it to Robert O'Brien to answer that. And I think it's an important element to that job, both communication with families, communication with the public, and I think Jason chronicles through his book the importance of the profile of the spotlight continuing to shine on people, on Americans who are held overseas. I think it's critically important. And I know Jason has some very poignant scenes in his book where he realizes that actually he's not, as the Iranians were telling him, nobody's talking about you, nobody's thinking about you. In fact, that's not the case. So I think it's a very important element of that job.
And I think, you go ahead, Jason.
I just wanted to add that I think it's important for journalists as well to be sensitive. I learned about several journalists who had tips about your negotiations in the final days, and if that information had come out more quickly and got ahead of events happening, I might still be sitting there.
That's a good point.
And so I think that it's always good for journalists to sort of err towards having I don't want to say adversarial relationship to power, but a skeptical one. But there are moments when it's not necessarily in everybody's interest to have all information out in the public. And I think a channel of communication with Envoy and folks in the media is probably a smart thing.
And I thank you for that question, Bill, because I think the other issue is, as Americans, myself very much included, I really feel we're really unaware as a whole just how many Americans are kidnapped every year. We're talking hundreds of Americans, and if we talk about unjust detainees, as the category Jason was in, we're talking thousands of Americans every single year detained around the world. And I think in that sense, I think it's a very important that our public realizes that, to recognize that we can be targets as Westerners in the world, and that these are very complex situations to resolve. But I think that's an excellent point you're making, Bill.
Just one quick point. We're talking about captures being detained. The Foley Foundation is very much involved in educating journalists, students, public, etc., in terms of risk assessment, trying to prevent some of these episodes. So I think we are responsible to decide, what is the best way to obtain a story? Is the story worth X or Y? I mean, how can we do this? I think that much more difficult to bring somebody home than it is to stay out of harm's way.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to begin to emphasize that whole idea of making good decisions.
Well, I wish we could keep going because I feel like if we got everybody together, we could come up with a new policy and solve it. There's a lot of great ideas and great enthusiasm and passion for this topic in this room, which is wonderful. I wanted to end by letting you know, I often find when I go to panels like this, I want to be able to do something and I don't know what to do, and I give you an option today. In the back and outside, you'll find these pamphlets about the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation, where it offers an opportunity for you to get engaged, to get involved, and learn more about it. So I hope you'll think about picking one up. And I want to thank everybody for particularly our panelists, for such an enlightening discussion, for such a fruitful discussion, and one that I think leaves all of us thinking about what we owe our fellow citizens and what we can do collectively to help those in danger. So thank you.
So much.
No, you guys. I think it was. I think you guys did all great.
Well, you. Thanks, Jason. You're gonna have to join us, and Mom. Give Mom. Oh.